Mark, good morning. Sorry for the early call. We were recently informed of a satellite breakup and need to have you guys start reviewing the safe haven procedure.
1 German, 4 Americans, and 2 Russians from the International Space Station, threatened by the debris of a satellite's explosion. It was destroyed by a Russian missile shot from Earth. The event has reignited tensions in space and on Earth.
Russia's dangerous and irresponsible behavior jeopardizes the long-term sustainability of outer space.
This show of power has ominously revived the shadow of a potential space war.
Russia doesn't believe in a Star War. I think they are bluffing.
Far above Earth, space becomes a new battlefield for the great powers.
The most significant threats for sure are from China and Russia.
The most important thing for China is to have peaceful use of outer space.
Naturally, every country conducts their own military testing to perfect their defense. Nothing unusual about that.
A race towards militarization seems to have begun.
We've declared that a warfighting domain not because of what we did, but because of what they have done.
If we are attacked in space tomorrow, we want to be able to launch a counterattack.
Could escalating tensions in space be a direct threat to world peace?
It's kind of only one mistake at one point that could really trip us into a war.
Since the launch of the first Sputnik satellite in 1957, more than 10,000 satellites have been launched into space, a territory without borders. Half of those satellites are still active, originating from 80 different countries. Entire economic sectors on Earth are dependent on these space tools. Telecommunication, weather forecasting, transportation. Key strategic applications for the 21st century. On the flip side, satellites have become a weakness for certain nations. This is a new development in the history of the space age.
In a way, countries that have the largest number of satellites in space are certainly the most vulnerable. So there's a lot of conversation about the American side of things, obviously, because there again, Americans have the largest number of objects in orbit, and they could pay a huge price for it.
2/3 of all civil and military operational satellites are American. China owns 10%, and Russia less than 5%. This American domination is key to understanding what is at stake in this fight for spatial sovereignty.
For the United States, their perception of being on the cutting edge of space technology is crucial. It's essential. Satellites are a big contributor to their economic power. They are an important element of the national interest. So, of course, they do everything possible to not allow even the shadow of a threat to that aspect of their power.
Anxious to preserve their strategic interests in space, in 2019, the U.S. decides to create a branch of the Army dedicated to space.
We're gathered here in the Rose Garden to establish the United States Space Command. It's a big deal. As the newest combatant command, SpaceCom will defend America's vital interests in space, the next warfighting domain. We're especially grateful to welcome the new leader of SpaceCom, General J. Raymond.
Good afternoon. Mr. President, thank you for hosting us today. In doing so, you honor the airmen, sailors, soldiers, and Marines that secure our high ground for our nation.
General Raymond represents the political will of the biggest spatial power in the world. That power is determined to keep their orbital supremacy.
The risk is there are countries that are out there that are developing capabilities to deny our access to space. And in doing so, they would deny the benefits that we all enjoy. You know, the average person, before you wake up in the morning and have your first cup of coffee, you've used space multiple times. And so space capabilities fuel your way of life.
The U.S. Department of Defense emphasizes the threat and boasts about the necessity of a military presence in space.
Millions feel the effects. Banks, airports, infrastructure. Our prosperity could be at risk.
Leading spatial infrastructure, the U.S.-owned Global Positioning System, the GPS, extends from 31 military satellites. Since the early 2000s, it has become a global reference for all human activity. Russia has its own fleet, GLONASS. China has its Beidou constellation. Europe has the Galileo system. These satellite fleets, over 12,000 miles away in space, are a crucial part of any great power's overall strategy. Galileo is part of the spatial property that is supervised by the French Space Command, created in 2019 and headed by General Michel Friedling.
The GPS and Galileo navigation constellations allow us not only to position and direct ourselves, but also to synchronize all of the world's clocks. When you lose synchronization of clocks, you lose a lot of things in transportation and in finance, and that can cause a lot of loss on Earth.
France is the first European country to place spatial defense as a priority on the political stage.
To possess a strong spatial defense is absolutely essential, and our daily activities depend on it. I am not talking about our soldiers' daily activities. Communication, observation, and geolocation via satellite, these are actions that are vital to military operations.
In the past 20 years, the various functions of satellites have multiplied on all fronts, turning space into a crucial domain for national security. With its spatial defense program, France has extended its fleet of military satellites. The French Space Commander supervises the launch of a new information satellite.
Everyone needs information. All military leaders need to know the terrain. We need extremely precise and reliable information so our political authorities can make the right decisions.
The CSO-2 is located in the nose cone of the Soyuz rocket. When it's finally operational in orbit, it will be able to take pictures night or day. Its image resolution is kept top secret.
What I can tell you is that it is a satellite with exceptionally high performance and that it belongs at the top of its class as an information satellite. When you can take satellite pictures of vehicles that are in motion in the desert, and those are cases we encounter every day in Sahel or in Levant in Iraq. We have also seen this very often in Syria. When you take pictures, you need to be able to say whether those vehicles are carrying armed men or not.
Thanks to these new satellite fleets, France consolidates its place within the great military space powers, next to Russia, China, and the United States. In Germany, a division was created within the Air Force headed by General Klaus Habersetzer.
For a modern industrialized nation like Germany, it's necessary that we have all the time full access to space and that we can use space-based capabilities. And we have to take into account, that in upcoming crises or conflicts, an enemy would like to at least to deny the use of space-based capabilities.
In Japan and England, the newly founded space armies are ready to defend their spatial territories, a terrain the military knows well, as space has been their playing field since the beginning of the Cold War. This military presence is the source of the current geopolitical spatial situation.
The military has been involved in space since the dawn of the space age, but it wasn't as publicly known as NASA or the Apollo program or the astronauts. From the very beginning, the US military and the Soviet military recognized the potential military benefits from space for things like communications or taking pictures and collecting intelligence. And so there have been military space programs since the earliest days of the space program.
During the Cold War, space even played a crucial part in the world's geopolitical equilibrium.
The military satellites were first sent by the Americans, then by the Russians. They were destined to make precise cartographies of the enemy's targets one could destroy. And so, because of that, satellites have served as a means of verification, a means of control, and the basis for strategic stability.
Space has truly participated in this balance, each party having military satellites, observation and telecommunication satellites, or missile launch detecting satellites, for instance. All of this to dissuade the other from attacking. And so, space has always been a reflection of its own strategic context.
This balance of dissuasion came at a cost. The technological race that the United States and the Soviet Union took part in marked the arrival of weapons in space. It is the beginning of the ASAT attacks, anti-satellite weapons operated from Earth. The objective is to show that you are technologically capable of destroying an object placed in orbit. The Soviets and the Americans were conducting these military tests until the 1980s. In 1983, Star Wars is even brought up in Congress. President Ronald Reagan sponsored a missile defense system to block an eventual Soviet nuclear attack.
U.S. spy satellites would watch the world below, detect Soviet missiles blasting off, compute the position and speed of each missile, alert battle stations.
The project is abandoned due to its exorbitant cost, but the American space industry is still technologically far ahead of the rest of the world. This marks the start of space armament under the guise of peace.
From the US perspective, during the Cold War, there was an acknowledged competition with the Soviet Union. There was some, back and forth, almost cat and mouse games of, I develop a capability, you develop a counter, and so on and so forth. When the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the US was left as the sole superpower.
The United States finds itself in the position of unchallenged space master for nearly 15 years, until the thunderous arrival of a new player on the geopolitical space scene. China performs an ASAT assault on one of its own satellites. Facing what they perceive to be a provocation, the United States answers with an ASAT assault of their own.
you a sense of what we saw last. At 10:26, the Lake Erie launched a Standard Missile 3 from the Pacific. They were northwest of Hawaii. At 10:50, the Joint Space Operations Center out in Vandenberg confirmed a breakup of the satellite.
China lets its ambitions be known. Space becomes yet another area of competition with the United States.
China is one of the main players on the international scene, so their space presence is in line with China's overall status, in its visibility, in what it wants to show the world of its abilities, of its competence, of the excellence of its educational system, of its high-tech industries.
Colonel Zhao Bo is a senior officer in the Chinese People's Liberation Army.
China is sending more and more satellites into the space. Of course, we are not the country that send more satellites than any other countries. That is the United States. But still, space is becoming more and more important for China.
China's message is simple. They like to say the United States is expanding their space presence. They also say the U.S. has potential space weapons, etc., etc. And we need to show that we are not just going to let them dominate space. And from the American side, they can immediately capitalize on that first test to say that all the money they have been spending for space protection is justified.
The United States Air Force has owned this high ground of space for decades. Other nations, other air forces only dream of making such a claim. But what if their dream became reality? Revisionist world powers have a new focus for their aggression. Their target? Space. They don't have to dominate it, just disrupt it.
China methodically develops its space program and rapidly gets up to date technologically. President Xi Jinping showcases China's global ambitions. They will be the greatest power in the world in 2045.
The idea of China becoming that powerful finally brings to light America's fears. These fears from the U.S. actually bring credibility to China's power and its growth on the international scene. China prefers being feared to being loved. And when they succeed in being feared by the United States, that is the best propaganda they could possibly ask for.
This is a game American leaders are ready to play, condemning China on a regular basis from the highest branches of government.
Just this week, the Pentagon released a report showing that China is aggressively weaponizing space.
Politicians are not the only ones pouring oil on the fire. The American military doesn't shy away from publicly decrying this Chinese pressure.
Today, we're facing competitors in space, but most importantly, it's the Chinese that are providing us that pacing threat. And their rapid expansion of space capabilities, both from a military perspective as well as a civil space perspective, is what we're seeing today, tomorrow, and in the future.
Stand by. Data building. Zooming in on grid.
By pointing out this Chinese threat, the United States lends credibility to this new player. But what is the reality and the scope of this threat? In the absence of surveillance cameras in orbit, radars, sensors, and telescopes are the only ways to detect satellites' trajectories from Earth. But decryption is needed to understand what is happening 300, 500, or 22,000 miles away in space. The AGI experts have detected intense Chinese military activity.
These days, spacecraft sometimes are intentionally coming very close to each other, not accidentally. So the term that we use there is rendezvous proximity operations, or RPO.
China has proven it could accomplish this difficult operation at 15,500 miles per hour.
Here we have a very interesting thing that happened. So ChinaSat 1C, which is a Chinese communication satellite, what you see all of a sudden is another Chinese spacecraft, SJ-17, came over very quickly and matched orbits with the ChinaSat 1C. In the past, spacecraft really didn't do these kind of things. They didn't maneuver close to each other frequently. They were more or less stationary in their slots. Now, today, there's so much more going on.
Bringing them together is a military exercise because SJ-17 is not a typical satellite.
The spacecraft is considered to be an anti-satellite weapons test. So it's got sensors on board, cameras on board, and it has a robotic arm on board that presumably could be used to grapple a spacecraft and do what it might. It could be potentially destroying something on a spacecraft, or it could actually be tugging that spacecraft and moving it to a place that would take it off its mission. So that does indicate that China has really very good understanding of what's going on in orbit and very good command and control of their spacecraft.
What really worries the United States is China's rapid technological rise over the past 15 years.
Under the military category, China is building a wide range of space capabilities. So they have their own version of GPS. They have their own military communication satellites. They have imagery and reconnaissance satellites. And at the same time, China has a program to develop their space weapons, ranging from a ground-launched missile that can collide and destroy a satellite, to electronic warfare and some directed energy, such as lasers.
But even if China is making up for its technological deficiencies, its spatial defense budget is still far from that of the United States.
The Chinese budget for space went from $5 billion to $10 billion, doubling in size. This is extremely impressive. So you could say, China has doubled its space budget. You could also say, even with $10 billion, China has only a quarter of the American spatial budget. If you compare China's spatial capacity to America's spatial capacity, China has far more reasons to feel threatened than the U.S.
The United States is in a league of its own in terms of budget, technology, and number of satellites. Their surveillance apparatus is simply gargantuan.
The United States has practically pioneered the ability to get close to other satellites and has satellites on orbit doing that today, primarily for intelligence purposes and surveillance. They want to know what other satellites are up in space and what they're doing.
These past few years, the American doctrine has evolved, adopting principles of cooperation with other nations. France is one of America's allies when it comes to spatial defense. The French space commander is making an official visit to the United States.
Une des forces stratégiques des États-Unis aujourd'hui.
Today, one of the United States' strategies is to build coalitions. They don't want to be on their own against the villains. Having a coalition is very important politically. Saying, we are many countries and we don't want these things happening in space, and we are going to deal with this together.
For the last few decades, the U.S. preferred to pretty much go alone and keep its space secrets to itself. I think in the last 10 years, the U.S. has recognized that going it alone is probably not going to be possible in the future.
At Colorado Springs, The commander of the French Space Command is allowed access to the United States Space Force headquarters. The goal of his meeting with his American counterpart is to facilitate the exchange of information and to provide mutual support for military operations. Many of these operations are launched from this command center.
I am a Space Force Guardian. That space is really a very critical environment and a critical domain that we have to defend. So to the benefit of not just the US, but for all of our allies and our partner nations.
These earthly power struggles continue in space. Despite their domination, the United States and its allies feel threatened by China, but also by their historical rival, Russia.
We grew up in a very peaceful domain, and now that has, because of the actions of China and Russia, that domain now is not peaceful and benign. It's a war-fighting domain with a threat.
In November 2021, Russia reignites diplomatic tensions by launching an ASAT missile.
Hey, Mark, good morning. We were recently informed of a satellite breakup and need to have you guys start reviewing the safe haven procedure.
45 years after its first missile, Russia repeats the maneuver, exploding its own inoperable satellite only 25 miles above the International Space Station. Fearing a collision with the debris, the astronauts take refuge aboard shuttles until the alert is lifted.
This test will significantly increase the risk to astronauts and cosmonauts on the International Space Station, as well as to other human spaceflight activities. Russia's dangerous and irresponsible behavior jeopardizes the long-term sustainability of our outer space.
In the face of international condemnation, how can we interpret this Russian action?
These days, the Russians feel very withdrawn from the international scene, being overshadowed by China. In the space domain they have inherited from the Soviet Union, and that they have more or less maintained, what we see them doing today is simply the execution of what they could already do. It is a way, if you will, that we need to be reminded of their existence.
ASAT tests have become a strategic tool to place oneself on the international chessboard. It is even a tool of domestic policy that the Indian Prime Minister wasn't afraid to use in 2019 during a political campaign.
The elections weren't going well for the ruling party, and India needed to show its population that it was a modern power with high-performing technologies that only a few other countries possessed. So, by conducting this test, Prime Minister Modi made it look like India was going up a notch on the international ladder.
भारत ने आज अपना नाम अंतरिक्ष महाशक्ति स्पेस पावर के रूप में दर्ज करा दिया है। अब तक दुनिया के 3 देश अमेरिका, रूस और चीन को यह उपलब्धि हासिल थी।
It was more about the politics than it was about the actual capability. I think that's really worrisome that anti-satellite weapons could be a status symbol.
The last Russian missile and the terror it triggered aboard the International Space Station has reminded us of the consequence of ASAT attacks that scatter debris in orbit. a process that could, by chain reaction, make space unnavigable.
These ASAT missile tests have demonstrated that these types of actions were probably not the right ones. This cannot be the weapon of the future to neutralize the enemy's resources.
If you decide to attack the satellites of your enemy in space, even about the debris that are generated from such attacks, they would scatter around all the orbit and become dangerous for all the countries involved. So in space, an attack is on one country is an attack on all countries.
Does the international community have the means to prevent a space conflict? A treaty was signed in 1967 at the height of the Cold War. The United States and the USSR had just tested nuclear weapons in space. This agreement only pertains to the prohibition of weapons of mass destruction in orbit. "40 years later, at the United Nations, China and Russia proposed a resolution to ban all types of weapons in space.
Weapons deployment in space by one state will inevitably result in a chain reaction. And this in turn is fraught with a new spiral in the arms race, both in space and on Earth.
But Americans and their allies rule out the Sino-Russian proposition.
Part of the challenge with this draft treaty is it doesn't cover ground-based space weapons, and it's difficult to define what a space weapon placed into orbit would be.
Comment définir l'usage? How can you categorize a satellite registered as a civilian maintenance tool that is capable of approaching and attacking one of your satellites with a robotic arm and will, in effect, neutralize your military satellite? What is considered a weapon in space? That is difficult to define. France believes that a treaty to ban weapons in space is completely utopian and inapplicable.
As it's impossible to prevent missile or laser attacks from Earth, and impossible to inspect every satellite in orbit, Americans and their allies propose instead to agree on a code of conduct.
I'd say that space is the wild, wild west, meaning that there's really nothing that's out there that describes what's safe conduct and what's professional conduct. And so we're working with our partners to help formulate these rules of the road, to help identify and help nations act in a responsible way.
But by asking for space weapons to be banned in front of the international community, China and Russia managed a neat trick. They appeared to be the biggest proponents of peace.
The most important thing for China, as China has advocated, is to have peaceful use of outer space and to avoid arms race in outer space. In other words, that is a prevention of weaponization of the outer space.
Just like China, Russian diplomacy proclaims its opposition to an escalation.
President Putin often likes to express himself on military and defense questions, and every time he emphasizes that he is against the implementation of weapons in space and the use of space for armed attacks on other countries. This is categorically ruled out. Putin has made it very clear that this is off the table.
This is an interesting diplomatic game for the Chinese and the Russians, who only have a few satellites, at least very few compared to the Americans. They have every interest in limiting America's space potential, to avoid having to spend more money to match them, especially since they don't have a need for it.
World views collide against one another. discussions end in stalemate, and the verbal escalation increases tensions.
I do believe that the United States doesn't want to be involved in this kind of talks at all, in spite of the good wishes of China and Russia, because the United States would wish to maintain its superiority in space, just like the superiority it has on the Earth.
The United States has regained our place of prestige as the world leader. As has often been stated, you can't be number one on Earth if you are number two in space. And we are not going to be number two anywhere.
This arm wrestling between the great powers kindles the weapons race to space.
We know that in the United States, the military-industrial complex is very powerful. And in order for the government to keep requesting these machines, you first have to frighten the population by saying, "These bad Russians, they are against us." We think they are preparing for Star Wars. Our country must defend itself, and the only way we can do that is to keep investing money and keep buying these machines. That's the only solution we see today.
China is our pacing threat in space, as well as the Russians. They've weaponized space, and quite frankly, we haven't weaponized space, for that matter. We've declared that a warfighting domain not because of what we did, but because of what they have done.
In the face of venomous posturing and preemptive declarations, there is growing fear that a real conflict will take place in space.
We are still below the threshold of what we call an armed conflict. So we are in a sort of gray zone where everyone shows off what they are working on, more or less. Some do it discreetly. Others do it more openly, more conspicuously. It is a sort of power play.
We're getting to the point where the U.S. and allied spacecraft and the operators of the spacecraft are very much on edge. China and Russia in particular have become very aggressive, and there are lots of different types of weapons that are now being tested, and some believe are actually now operational in space. It's kind of only one mistake at one point that could really trip us into a war.
Should we be expecting at any moment the disintegration of a satellite deliberately targeted by an enemy missile?
No satellites have been destroyed in anger as part of a conflict to date. I think if it happens, the public may not even know it happened, because it may happen to one of these very secretive satellites that we don't know about.
An entire range of weapons more discreet and pernicious than a missile strike have appeared, like this Russian military satellite that launches another satellite into space. In 2020, the nesting doll story causes consternation.
Tonight, new concerns inside the U.S. defense community over a Russian military satellite exhibiting some very strange behavior. Our Brian Todd is on the story for us. Brian, why are officials keeping an eye on this particular piece of equipment? It's very interesting.
It is, Jim. They're doing that because this satellite seems to have done something that U.S. officials admit they have never seen before. It has birthed two other satellites, according to experts, and they're worried the Russians could use it as a weapon in space.
We know there was something like a projectile that was released. That is unusual, and we've not seen that from other countries. To date, only Russia has had an operational co-orbital anti-satellite weapon system.
When it comes to Russian dolls, it's only natural for Russia, for every country naturally runs tests to perfect certain systems, and that is the case in space as well. There's a term for this, and this is what I like to call in French a technological watch. It's a simple way of understanding this concept. This doesn't mean these systems will be used offensively. In fact, the military doctrine of our country excludes the use of force against other countries' spatial installations.
You have to see the Russians' actions as an attempt to show the Americans that they are not alone, and that finally it is very, very difficult to have complete supremacy in space, and that even when you are far smaller, technologically speaking, than America, you can still find a way to somehow be a big nuisance.
Russia proves that despite its small budget, 10 times smaller than the American budget, it understands space strategy perfectly. France discovers in 2018 that a Franco-Italian military satellite has been approached by a Russian satellite named Louche Olympe. Since then, at the French Space Command, they keep an eye on this satellite maneuvering 22,000 miles above Earth.
From our geostationary orbit, we're still following the Louche Olympe based on its potential target.
So now, where is it?
It's here.
Approximately 80 degrees east.
Exactly. It's there. It left the previous target about a week ago, so it's drifting about 2 degrees a day.
In every military headquarters, Louche Olympe is the object of very close surveillance.
It appeared at the end of 2014 and started being operational at the beginning of 2015. And since 2015, it has been on a mission. It follows its geostationary route and it positions itself close to targeted satellites. We, as the military, we talk about information in the mainstream media. People prefer the term espionage, but it is the same thing.
The Russian spy satellite is about to enter the zone where Syracuse, French military satellites, are located.
Syracuse 3, Antoine. What position is it in?
Right now it's 46 degrees east, General.
46 degrees, now it's at 80 degrees, so if we have to watch it for the next 20 days, in about 15 or 20 days, it could stop close to Syracuse 3. When you develop surveillance tools, you're able to see very precisely who is who and who is doing what in space. And you're also able to respond to these actions. And that helps preserve a peaceful use of space. We have to avoid an escalation that might lead to a real space confrontation someday. Nobody can gain from a space confrontation. Nobody.
Nevertheless, the perspective of a conflict on Earth that would spread to space is a scenario envisioned by the commander of the French Space Command. In this full-scale exercise, a fictional continent, a contested border, confrontations on Earth, but also in orbit. An enemy satellite gets dangerously close to a French military satellite, only a few hundred miles from Earth. In the face of this hostile act, French space soldiers are calculating an evasive maneuver.
How long would it take from the moment we give the orders? About 3 hours.
You have to evaluate the seriousness of the situation to decide whether to react or whether not to react.
When you make a decision to start to move a satellite, you're reducing its lifespan because you're using fuel. And so that's also an effective way to hurt an enemy when you force them to maneuver. You're reducing their potential.
High-speed chase, espionage. In practice, space war isn't so different from any other war. Adversaries are practicing dissuasion even while they are bracing for the worst.
Our goal is to not get into a conflict, but the best way to do that is to be able to be prepared to fight and win if deterrence were to fail. That's exactly our focus.
And just like on Earth, the attack most feared by the military is an invisible one.
Most people believe that war in space would start out with some sort of cyber event. So an adversary might try to deny the use of either a U.S. or allies spacecraft through cyber means, so penetrating the computers. All the satellites are all basically flying computers. And so getting onto those computers and either causing them to shut down or do things that they wouldn't normally do.
The scenario brought up most often by the Americans, or by the Chinese, is a conflict around Taiwan. It is clear that obstructing the American forces by disabling their satellites, it would be a huge advantage for China.
To reach these new strongholds, hundreds of miles in space, the military also has access to many types of lasers to indicate to an enemy that you have seen them get close, to threaten them, or hit them.
What we are seeing today is deployment and testing of the dazzling capabilities, mostly through ground installations.
Blinding, jamming, sabotage, these hostile maneuvers are a reality in space.
A well-built laser can burn part of the adversary's target and therefore render it inoperable. But it's not going to destroy or explode it. Experiments have already been performed on flying targets.
One of the aspects of war in space is the fact that satellites don't have mothers. Well, if an adversary were to take out a satellite, that's less severe an act than costing a human life. And because of that, it's more likely to happen. So for that reason, people are really worried about how things could cascade.
All the components of an escalation are well in place. And with that comes the fear of an ever-growing arsenal of space weapons. The German astronaut Thomas Reiter spent 350 days in space aboard Mir, and later the International Space Station, 250 miles above Earth, less than 60 miles below the first satellites in low orbit. Right at the forefront of this new theater of operations.
We are doing on board the International Space Station is a fantastic example for international cooperation. You have to imagine that more than 100 countries worldwide are pursuing common goals for the benefit of everyone. So you can understand that with this perspective, you have kind of a critical view on weaponization of space. If the use for military operations is more or less increasing, going on a spiral upward, I think weaponization of space is a very, very critical issue.
As the space station sees its final hours, is the idea of nations cohabitating in space peacefully becoming a fading dream, ushering in a new era where space is merely a battlefield?
Ideally, we would prefer that no military space programs or space weapons were developed. That is the fundamental wish that would allow true security in space. The reality is simple. We're seeing the opposite. So all of this brings up the need for an active and creative diplomacy.
Space reveals deep antagonism between nations that play a dangerous game, all the while pretending to clamor for peace. In this bluffing game, the arrival of the private space sector adds another layer of complexity. Elon Musk has started launching several thousands of satellites to bring high-speed internet to the planet. When it comes to the internet in space, Americans have already cornered the market, but China and Europe hope to get a piece of the pie. In the years to come, new commercial stakes could increase the risk of a spark that would set it all ablaze, making the security of space even more urgent.